Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country. Folks, literally, the atmosphere is being agitated by antennas as we speak. And that agitation is being received by antennae that are being transponded over diodes, and eventually you're listening to it. This is the Uncommon Good, Iowa Catholic Radio on the airwaves, on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, and of course all of our good podcast listeners. So whether you are listening through the manipulated electromagnetic field or the digital reality that you're probably receiving on your phone through the same electromagnetic field, this is the Uncommon Good, and we are happy to be with you. But that was probably more science at the top of the hour than you were expecting. I'm Bo Bonner. I'm not a scientist in any way. That was just me perusing the internet last night. I am the senior advisor for mission initiatives and the director for the Center for Human Flourishing at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Bud, do you happen to be a radio scientist?
Not at all, but I do work with science professors.
There you go.
I oversee general education at the college, Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences.
So we are so happy to be here with you, no matter how you are tuning in. Bud, summer in full swing. I'm sweating as we speak. I don't know if people can hear a difference. Maybe a desperation in my voice, but realizing that we have multiple months of this. But I can tell that there's also people that really do have a spring in their step because the outdoor activities have commenced. And there's some people, God bless them, I'm not one of them, that have been waiting long for this. So I hope everybody is having a joyful, wonderful, safe, wear that sunscreen, all that sort of jazz summer. But that certainly has been on the roll here. Now, here at Mercy College of Health Sciences, who underwrites our show, we want to thank them, mchs.edu. Summer at this point, man, are they sort of they're in the thick of things at least. But we have a summer semester that allows people to go straight through and get into that workforce. Nurses, allied health that need them so bad, mchs.edu.
I like that way our school is structured because sometimes you go to a college campus during the summer and it feels kind of ghost towny. Not here.
No.
I was just this week seeing plenty of students on campus and there was this vibrancy and I was like, it's good to be alive.
Yeah, I mean, the good to be alive. I was under the air conditioning saying I'm barely alive, but I'm glad that no, I'm kidding. Going around campus, it certainly is the case, and there'll be plenty of air conditioning at the campus as well. But summers are a living, breathing thing here at Mercy College of Health Sciences.
Yeah.
If you're interested, of course, it's never too early to think about the fall semester, mchs.edu. But once more, thank you, Mercy College, for underwriting the show.
One thing that helps me to get through this time of year, Bo, is baseball. Mm-hmm. And on a text thread with some friends in Des Moines that we have, you and another guy were talking about some of the crazy baseball statistics. And if you're a sports fan, that's one of the great joys of baseball, just how much attention there is to the numbers, But one that jumped out to me was George Brett, who played for the Royals. Mm-hmm. He won a batting title in 3 different decades. I had to go check that out. I had to make sure. Baseballreference.com.
Was it wrong?
It was right. He did it. And you know what's cool? I'm going to sound like such an old man here. But it was amazing growing up in Omaha. There was a time where once a year, the Kansas City Royals would come to Omaha and play the Omaha Royals. And you just would never see MLB players do that anymore.
No.
But I could check out. I'm trying to think who else. I think Brett Sabenhagen pitched for the Royals at that time.
Yep.
I'm more of a Cardinals fan, so I don't know the Royals lore, but I remember George Brett being there, and that was cool to see him in person.
Absolutely. And that's a whole other issue about stats that don't seem real, so you have to go check them out. It's funny because baseball, it seems to me that it thrived during radio. There's something very appropriate, here we are on the radio. Baseball just sounds good on the radio. But I also think it's sort of primed for the digital age because of all of its, looking back and, like you said, its lore, its numbers. So, yay baseball, yay summer. We're going to talk about neither of those. We're going to talk about See, Judge, Act. And if you don't know what that means, Don't worry, folks. That's just, you need to tune back in. It'll be interesting, I promise. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Today, we're going to harken back. If you've listened to us for a while, you know we had a whole year where we talked about sacrificial leadership, and we return to these themes of leadership every so often, partly because Bud and I have been punished by God in somewhat leadership situations, but then also because I think it's not even mean to say that there's a general sense of leadership crisis in the church and society. So to dwell on leadership in a theological and philosophical key is certainly always warranted, it seems to me. So, but don't honestly remember exactly where this sort of came back up in my mental space. I know I was using it for some of the stuff I was writing on, but when it comes to process of decision making, which we've brought up multiple times, we've given talks on this, as boring as it sounds, it's actually very elemental to how society runs. And my argument is that when we talk about the universal call to holiness, and that, the holiness of the laity in the secular world is where we begin to see the sort of Christian difference, we often act like what that means is like, oh, so you should, be nice and wave at people or something. But what I want to say is that gets down to, we have these social forms in corporations and in institutions that make huge decisions that really do affect the day-to-day life, not only of a lot of employees and customers, but just people in general. So to apply Catholic principles to these realities, I'm sorry, folks, I think it's actually very important and underdone. One thing I want to consider, this has been in the works for a while, but certainly when Pope Francis pointed to it in some of the things he was talking about in Laudato Si famously, the see, judge, act model of decision-making. It's very simple, and I think if you think about it in terms of like where it comes from in Catholic world, it will make a lot of sense. But it's something that I think people can, in their actual realities, in the secular workplace, if they don't have a role where they can name it as such, they themselves can use it or encourage it among people. And it's sort of a principle of decision-making. It's not, it doesn't come with like tons of, you have to follow these 15 steps. It's a sort of general take on things. So, Bud, I was thinking we can actually dwell on this, throw this out to people. You, I would say, have more on-the-ground experience with people who were talking about See, Judge, Act, and I think it will make sense with the Pope Francis angle. So I'm going to throw it over to you for a little bit.
Yeah, so most of my experience with this idea comes from my time at St. Louis University, which is a Jesuit institution. And that was the See, Judge, Act approach was a big part of what we were doing in campus ministry. And then I think it bled over, Bo, into the work that you and I have done with servant leadership here. So as Christians, we have to be about discernment. There's a way in which human beings, the way that we approach life, the issues that are most pressing, that are causing us the most pain points, tend to be front and center of our minds. And there's this kind of tendency or temptation to say, like, I want to resolve this rough edge as quickly as possible or whatnot. But there's a way in which you can go about that and exacerbate the problem if you don't take the right kinds of steps. And so it's a really basic point, but we talk about this with students at Mercy College when they do service learning, so they're involved in their community in some way, that there has to be a level of reflection in how they go about that. There's a priest and theologian, I'm blanking on his name, which is, it's probably better because I think his theology was flawed in some ways, but so I don't want you to go necessarily like track down all that he wrote, but he said something to the effect, he was working in South America, and he said, when I fed those who were hungry around me, like the government lauded me, when I tried to resolve the conditions that led to that hunger, they wanted to assassinate me.
No, actually, you could read him. That's Blessed Oscar Romero.
That's Romero?
On Palma's Dead.
Okay.
Sure. Yep.
I think I've heard it attributed to someone else, but we're going to do Romero. He's a saint. And basically, like that gets to the point that Christians and good people of goodwill in general will oftentimes see the sort of needs around them and want to do something sort of quickly to meet that need. I know, Bo, like when you were at Duke Divinity School, that you worked for a time at a homeless shelter and things. And again, you have persons who get involved in those activities and they've got good impulses. They see a need and immediately they sort of like have this impulse to want to make a difference. But sometimes the quote unquote making a difference actually sort of, it's either a Band-Aid solution, so not really a solution, or like I said, it exacerbates the problem. So for instance, like I think if you see someone on the street or at a street corner who's asking for a handout or for alms or whatnot, as Christians, like there's good reason to give alms and not to say like, well, I don't know exactly how those are going to be spent. But if you're at a homeless shelter and you're working with people on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, if someone's struggling with addiction, ready cash is maybe not going to be the best thing for their future direction. So all that to say, taking the time to step back to see, so that involves observation. In the servant leadership class, we ask students to like kind of go out into their communities, not to carry like a notepad and a magnifying glass, but maybe like have a coffee at a cafe and sort of observe their community. Secondly, after you go out, you step back and you judge. And so you have a time of discernment and reflection on what you've just observed. And then those two activities, I said those kind of were there, those two activities inform the action steps that you take. So that you sort of have this kind of, you have a proper runway that leads up to the intervention.
No, I like how you put that a lot. So I'm going to go very much from left field. I even told Bud before we got here, I'm like, I'm going to make a point that it gets back to this, but it will throw you for a loop. So I'm going to talk about Dante and Satan real quick. But I actually think you set it up very well. So Dante's devil is very interesting for a whole host of reasons. And then again, folks, it's not like theology. The church's document does not contain Dante's Inferno in it, like when it starts talking about hell. So it's poetic. However, one of the poetic motifs it throws out that's very interesting that I think when it comes to things like the modern world, its frantic pace, like you were saying, Bud, our need and our want to do something quickly. So the devil in Dante is in the bottom level of hell, and he's encased in ice. There's all sorts of other parts of hell in Dante's poetic rendering that are on fire, but in the middle, the devil is encased in ice. And part of this, poetically, right, is to say, since this is the most lack of love possible in the universe, of course it will be cold, because in the Middle Ages, movement, and love was seen as a movement, was associated with heat. And even though they didn't have the physics of it completely right, certainly they're correct, right? Like heat is molecules in motion, even in a physical sense. And absolute zero would be the case where nothing's moving. And so what Dante does is say, because there's a lack of love, everything down there is cold. Now, what's interesting is all of the sinners, the worst ones in Dante's medieval world, which would be traitors and betrayers, are encased in ice because they are the symbol of a lack of love, and so they can't move. With the exception of the devil is constantly moving. However, how Dante has poetically rendered hell, the devil's frantic movements of his wings stirs up this wind that constantly encases him in ice. And so the devil, paradoxically, is always active, but never moves. And so, in stark contrast, right, the goal of the Christian life is to be so motivated by the fire of God's love that you are peaceful and tranquil. So you would think, right, that this thing that is like the most heat, the most movement, right, would mean that you're frantic and going around, but it's love that actually makes us peaceful, still, tranquil, unified. Because in God, love motivates all things, but rest is perfect activity. It's activity without remainder. So the so to speak, quote unquote, again, poetically, the heat of love, when it is perfectly attached to its object, is reflected right back, and there's nothing left over, so there's no heat given off. The heat, so to speak, is perfectly exchanged. Okay, all poetic, all poetic. What does this have to do with see, judge, act? Well, on one hand, but I think the first thing that's obvious is to frantically move and to do tons of stuff when you're trying to solve problems paradoxically leaves most organizations never moving forward. But I got to say, in my short time in being in any sort of around leadership positions, do you not agree with me, friend, that the sort of frantic, directionless movement of a lot of leadership, of a lot of institutions, leaves them in the same place. And see, judge, act, if it's trying to do anything at all, is, as to your point, eliminate the short, frantic movements, to be willing to, quote unquote, waste the time to observe before and think about those observations before we move forward. Not just to take time, but to avoid the devil's frantic movements that encases him in ice. Okay. Conversely, I think what we should try to obtain is, as close as possible, tranquil movements. And of course, in God, in the love of God, if we love God and we love ourselves and our neighbor in the love of God, those tranquil movements are perfect without remainder. And so they are both perfectly restful and active. I agree that that's not going to happen fully on this side of the Veil of Tears, maybe in mystical union, but certainly not in an institution's decision-making, because you're human and we're dealing with life as it's lived. But the closer we can get to that, Bud, the closer that we can make our decisions as peaceful and tranquil as possible, as intentional as possible, the closer we're going to get to the movement in ourselves and in our institutions actually not depleting energies, but helping gain those energies. Again, that's an ideal. There's so much stuff that happens in a day. Sometimes you have to without wanting to make a frantic decision. But whatever else see, judge, act is, I actually think, but it's to try to not make decisions like the devil encased in hell in the ninth circle of Dante, and as much as possible to be at peace and tranquility in our decision making. And this simple principle of action hopefully grounds us in trying to attain that. So what do you think? Do you think that was too far out of left field, or does that land?
No, I think there's a lot of great stuff there. And when you were first talking about frantic movements, I actually thought about a point that C.S. Lewis makes in the Screw Tape Letters. So this is this creative book that he had where he wrote from the perspective of two demons writing letters to each other, and they were talking about like corrupting souls. And so you get like a sort of glimpse into the strategy of the enemy. And with one of the souls, I think the main one that they're trying to corrupt in the book, there's this conversation between the two demons where the more experienced demon, that doesn't really make sense metaphysically, but the one that's kind of like worse in a demon quality control sort of way. Yeah. He's telling the other guy, like, don't
the demon HR department,
which there's a lot to be said there. Yeah. Where he says to the guy, like, with this man, don't try to trip him up with these extreme temptations, like around adultery or like some sort of major infidelity or like financial sort of like greed act or whatever. He says like the guy will like, he'll sniff out the evil from a distance. He'll see like this is a particularly bad action and sort of know like it's not best for him. And so with this guy, what they do is they try to get him with distraction. He says like one of the best things that you can do, of course this is mid 20th century, is like get him to pick up the newspaper as quickly as possible in the morning. And that's going to get his mind sort of going around the anxieties that he has. And obviously like the newspaper's written from a certain perspective. You think about cable news today, the sort of how it can make a soul unsettled. Just, I don't know. That's what happens to me if I do 10 minutes of cable news.
Let alone Twitter.
Yeah. And so like in that case, when you think about the see, judge, act model, it's not even bringing the guy to action, but it's actually, I mean, it's sort of like, it's pushing him towards this kind of frantic movement where he thinks like, well, I'm giving a lot of thought to the problems of the world, but he's really just spinning the wheels in his own spiritual life in his own mind. You go back to Jesus and his formation of the disciples. See, when I have these conversations with people, this kind of ties into a lot of what we've talked about with politics. Mm-hmm. I'll say like, let's tap the brakes and let's think critically about how like the church should relate to the world, et cetera, et cetera. And they're like, well, yeah, but if this happens, then like the results, the outcomes are going to be catastrophic. And so we're kind of like we've been talking about, sort of like we're driven towards that frantic modality. Whereas Christ, I mean, the reason I bring up today's problems, if you look back to the first century, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of God's people who could say like, well, our problems are intractable, mm-hmm. or the sort of impression that we're suffering under, it's unbearable. But our Lord's response was not like, it wasn't like the Zealots. It wasn't like, let's take extreme actions to throw off this oppression as quickly as possible. It was a whole 3-year formation, which for him started with 40 days of fasting in the desert. So you think about that sort of like putting down of roots. And then with his disciples, like the 12 who he called around him, he needed them to flip their vision. And so a lot of, I think particularly of St. Peter, like a lot of ways that Peter trips up is through a sort of impetuousness where Christ is trying to get him to slow down and to see the world from the get-go through the lens of faith, through this kind of new thing that God is doing in their midst.
No, I think this is good. Like a sort of, we can make T-shirts that say, "Are we about to kill God today?" And if you say no, you're like, well, then it's not worse than what Jesus and the disciples were dealing with, right? I mean, I don't mean that flippantly in any way, but that is the sort of stark relief we have to put our issues with the church, with the world into, is go, hey, if I am reading the New Testament right, the pressing issue was deicide.
That's right. Yeah.
So have any of us, I mean, none of us are making the Tower of Babel. Maybe we're making like close clones, but we're not trying to climb a tower. And then, I mean, I think there's people who go, you'll read books that are like, they're trying to crucify Jesus on multiple stages and things like this. And look, I don't want to make this sound like we're making it like, hey, just be groovy, guys, no worries, because it's also true that in any place that the Imago Dei, the image of God in a human soul, is desecrated, that is an assault to God, no doubt. We don't even need to get into people blaspheming the Holy Sacrament by dealing with it frivolously, or let's not even get into places named after holy things that don't live up to the calling of their name. Yeah. I agree with all that. However, if we're not killing God incarnate today, selling him for 30 pieces of silver, if we're not doing that, then we have no right to, like you said, supersede Jesus in the quickness of our movements. That's what I'm getting at, is, to your point, Jesus the entire time knew what his fate was. And, but did you ever get into the dorky arguments? And not to be mean to all Protestants, but like growing up evangelical and even getting into Protestant seminary, there was always people being like, well, why didn't Jesus just be immediately born and crucified so we could have, and why didn't he do this right after the garden? Yeah. And you go, well, okay, what a way to make God himself like a tool, right? A utility, right? Like, you can imagine that every time humans slipped up, Jesus just shows up and is crucified. It also shows you there's problems with a lot of that version of the atonement theory. But what I'm getting at is God himself saw it fitting to wait for the fullness of time. Think about that in many of the ways that the church talks about the incarnation itself. In the fullness of time, God did X, Y, and Z. So what can actually be so pressing in Christian manners that we do not take time, like you said, to imitate our Lord and go be silent, go pray, go reflect, and then judge, right? Like, assess the situation and make a firm intention of judgment before we then act.
Yeah, a lot of the work that we do as people of faith is just, it's slow work. And Bo, whenever we talk about these things, we have to be cognizant of potential misreadings or mishearings. And you've already brought up, we're not trying to say today, everything's fine.
Yeah.
Like the old meme of the dog sitting in the burning house, everything's fine. No. Not the case. And secondly, this is not a call to sort of laziness or just like, well, we can kind of like slow play it for the sake of, dragging our feet or something. Mm-hmm. But if you think about the saints, and we've talked about this sort of thing on the show, like think about what St. Benedict accomplished. It really is like centuries long project. The great cathedrals that were built, some of those who started the projects and made great sacrifices didn't see the outcome of their handiwork. As a parent of 8, my mind goes to raising children, one of the most like inefficient sort of like long-term human projects that we can undertake, Absolutely. But the kind of change that we want to affect, or the kind of work that we want to be about, there's a lot of times there's just not an easy way to bring it about. And man, there are so many examples going through my mind. I know we're close to a break. Mm-hmm. One that I'll throw out just as a point of reflection as we do go to break. You think about the pro-life movement, and I think those who have done the See, Judge, Act methodology as they've gone about pro-life work, they would be the first to testify to this. Mm-hmm. But there's a kind of way in which where like people look at some of the great injustices in our country and they say, if we just enact the right laws, like things will be right. Now, I do think the law is a teacher. It's important that we care about those things, et cetera, et cetera. But you saw with like the Dobbs decision a few years ago, which was like a monumental achievement. I'm not saying like it should be reversed or anything like that. But right after that, at the state level, there was some real terrible legislation that was pushed. And Americans who maybe shaded pro-life, they weren't all the way to the Catholic position, they kind of supported those things because they had this kind of reactionary like, oh, sort of like, you know, the language of like our fundamental freedoms or something are being taken away. And all that I'm saying is like those who are willing to do the spade work and have this see, judge, act approach to pro-life work, they kind of recognize that even at the Supreme Court level, but certainly at the level of legislation, there's not a simple lever that you can pull.
Absolutely.
That there's this kind of long-term work that's closer to farming than it is to beating a video game.
Amen. No, I actually think both of those, all of that was great, but even the contrasting the farmer approach to the video game approach, very good. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It is wonderful to have you with us. We have been talking about the relatively famous, I think, at least in dorky Catholic world, see, judge, act model of decision-making and moving things forward. I hope people, if you didn't get to listen to the first segment, please go check out the podcast and listen to it. Not to toot our own horn. It went to really great places, and I think we got to the heart of something that you and I, Bud, have been trying to get at with our sort of leadership talks and things like this. But part of it is that frantic movements help no one. And the Lord himself has again and again pointed out why it's important to take time before you do things. Now, I think that there's reasons for this. So another sort of dead horse that I like to kick all the time, Bud, is that there's sort of two movements or modes in which humans generally approach intellectual issues. There's all sorts of ways to address this, but I'll just bring up Joseph Pieper's idea in Leisure, the Basis of Culture. He gets at this point that, you know, there's two approaches to how we engage the world rationally. So it's not just there's one way in which our brain thinks, but he'll talk about the difference between intellection, or intellectus is like the Latin, and then ratio, or rationality. And he goes, look, the sort of difference is, on one hand, with intellection, it's receptive. It's not passive. It's actively receptive, right? We sort of open the aperture of our ability to know, and we let things come to us. I think this is sort of the poetic mode, the artistic mode, but I don't want to exclude that science and math involve this, right? There's all sorts of people who talk about they go to bed and they wake up with resolutions to their math problems, because it's not just you like numbers and I like pretty things. There is an aspect of our mind where we allow the world to sort of make its impression on us. And I think that's the C part, Bud. Like, C is intellectus, right? Allow the world to be actively received into our souls. Then we get to ratio, the rationality. And remember, a ratio, which is where your rationality comes from, is saying this compared to that, this to that, this to that, like where we're making those connections. So if intellectus is about attention, then rationality or ratio is about focus. So this is where we start to break things down. We get active, as it were, on the things that we have observed intellectually, that we have allowed, we've received. And so now we act upon them, we chew upon them, we meditate, we really try to think about the constituent parts and how they relate. So that's the judgment part. And so I think we go from attention to focus to then intention. And that's the action part, axio. I think that's Latin. If not, it's a Bo Latinism. Axio. So we've paid attention to the world, we've seen, we've received it. We then went to judgment, where we are, rationality, ratio. We've broken it down. We've chewed upon it. We've made judgments about what we've received into our souls. And then we make an intention to do something about it, and we act. And I think that's why this model, it took me a while for it to really land, but like I think it's been landing to me, because it takes that two different modes of approaching the world intellectually, and sort of in like a syllogism, or a fecund relationship between a man and a woman, births a child. So the fecundity of intellect and rationality bears fruit in action, in the intention to do what we the will acting upon what intellect and reason has laid before it.
Yeah, and that all it ties into this wonderful course that we were able to take about a year ago. I always get the acronym wrong. CCEP, right?
Yes.
Catholic Church Ecology Project.
Church Communication Ecology Project.
Yeah, sorry about that. I struggle with acronyms sometimes, but our central part of the course was reflection on the way that our decisions never operate in sort of a vacuum, that each decision has this kind of reverberation, and it starts to ripple outwards and impact other areas of an entire institution. Mm-hmm. So for Bo and myself, with our work at Mercy College, when we think about this, a lot of it goes back to higher education and sort of the conversations and the decisions that are made in that realm. So if you think about something like a college is naturally going to be concerned about its students' level of success. Like if they're admitted to the college, how are they going to do when they actually land here? Mm-hmm. And so, I'll kind of speak in broad terms with what I'm saying. I'm not, necessarily talking about Mercy College. I'm drawing on my experience here, but thinking about these things at a national level. So there can be sort of this impulse to say like, well, if we want our students to be successful, maybe we'll have them do some sort of standardized testing or have these kind of like measures that they meet before they come here. And that can be like, that can be an indicator of success. Mm-hmm. And when most people hear that, they think automatically like, oh, this is great. Like you want the students to do well. This is sort of a measuring stick to see where they're at. And then, and then that's going to let us know like what sort of students to admit in, and, it will be the age of Aquarius. What you see is like, so speaking about it like benignly, not making judgments at this point, if you tweak that factor, it's not going to only impact student outcomes. There's going to be all sorts of like the types of student. I mean, the kinds of students who you have coming to you are going to be different, right? So like if one of your admission standards is a standardized exam, I mean, there are going to be students who do better and worse on that, not because of their level of intelligence, but because are they good test takers? That's gonna shape enrollment, and all of a sudden, like what you have to begin to think about when you're having these conversations within an organization or even at the national level is you have to think about your entire system as this kind of ecology, like on the analogy of an ecosystem. So you've got like swamplands in a particular part of the country. If you drain those swamplands or you set up a dam nearby or something like that, there's going to be these trickle down effects, not only in the specific space where the dam is built, but further downstream. And so, I mean, it's all tied together as a whole.
No, this is great because, okay, live on air, I'm making a connection. But we've been working towards this the entire time with our servant leadership course. When we've talked about, for instance, we took this from Roger Scruton, he talked about conservatives' version of conservation and ecology. We had people read this because we wanted to point out that we're always trying to like say it's not black and white or easy political situations on this. But he had this idea of like I'm going to mess it up, oikophilia, right, which means love of place. And he pointed out that there's a localism that you have to have in ecology. Like if you just tell people like you should care about planet Earth, it's hard because it's an abstraction. But if you're like, hey, how the river you grew up by was important to you, now think about what we're doing to other people's rivers and how that might destroy their livelihood. Like that's his idea about how you would get people to care about the environment. So then we would talk about Haiti, where they dammed one of the most important rivers, and it destroyed all sorts of things because they weren't thinking through all of the ramifications. And then you go to that Notre Dame CCEP program. Rachel Carlson is the same sort of deal. They thought about a problem very narrowly, right? Like mosquitoes are bad. And so then they go, let's solve the problem. And they go, DDT solves that problem. And they did solve the problem, right? It kills mosquitoes. It just kills lots of other things. And so when you talk about see, judge, act in the mode we're talking about, intellectus, ratio, and then actio, if you don't allow the whole situation to act upon you, when you go to make judgments, you're going to make thin judgments, right, or shallow ones. You're not going to make, exactly like you're pointing out, ecologically full ones. And do you think that's what? And so then when you act, you act in a very truncated way. I mean, that's what we were trying to get at with students, talking about things like Haiti in the dam.
Well, and that's where this entire conversation on See, Judge, Act also ties in closely to another key element of Catholic social teaching, and that's solidarity.
Yep.
So you thought about, you're sort of hinting at like ways that sometimes leaders can fiddle in a local issue and actually make things worse. And that in our servant leadership course, we talked about the context of Haiti, and Haiti is a prescient example because we've got a place that has some serious pressing social issues, but where Westerners or other nations have been closely involved in trying to solve those. And so, obviously with its proximity to the United States, or not obviously, but like inevitably, the U.S. has at times been concerned or interested in what's going on in Haiti. I mean, however you want to frame that politically. And so you've seen these interventions. So it's like, well, there's a lack of economic development. So we're going to introduce like modern power grids and things like that into Haiti, and this will create jobs for Haitians, et cetera, et cetera. Oftentimes that work was done without any sort of conversation with local leaders or local communities. And so you didn't have that kind of solidarity that you see so emphasized in Catholic social teaching, where an outsider doesn't come in and just try to like solve the problem immediately, but has these conversations about what are elements actually like on the ground. And so a lot of times when the so-called solution is top down or externally imposed, it doesn't have this integral sort of like organic development that relates or works well with the local culture. In the United States, I mean, like we don't have to move to Haiti. You talk about like having a love for a local river or whatever, and I mean, weirdly, like a lot of times those who are closest to the land are maybe the last person's thought about when sort of like ecological issues are tackled. And so you have to have the See, Judge, Act methodology and have that kind of combined with a sort of solidarity with local communities.
What we see so often when you have top down, and so there's no lack of solidarity and subsidiarity, both, you get a lot of act, then see, and then go judge. Oh, that was bad. Right. And so the reflection happens afterward, and a lot of the reflection is rut-row. And then that makes sort of like the next thing you need to do, because you need to clean up your mess. Now what do people local on the ground think? They're like, we don't trust these people. And then it's this vicious cycle where we get into the sort of debates we have today. Like, you can't trust the experts. And you go, experts, if you would have taken the time to see, to be patient enough, it's not that you have to get buy-in by like, I think people render this in sort of just sort of consumerist or even like modern neo-democratic terms, and I don't mean that in terms of political parties, where you just go, oh, you got to win over the support. And you go, no, if you use your intellect and have the patience to see, and you get people to notice that you deeply understand the reality on the ground that you're talking about before you make the judgment, not everyone's going to buy in because humans are humans, but it's just going to be a very different thing, bud. I actually think this ties in with John Henry Newman, like we always think it does.
Newman! For Joe Stopulos, this next point is going out to you on air. Newman point.
But actually not from the idea. This is from his talks on the Benedictine colleges, I believe. But, you know, he has this very famous part where he goes, there's 3 ages of the church. And so he talks about the poetic, the scientific, and then the rhetorical. And I've talked about this before because his image of the poetic age is the Benedictines, and I think he has this one nailed. He then talks about the scientific age, and he talks about the Dominicans. He then moves to the rhetorical age, and he talks about the Jesuits. And to be honest, but I don't know why didn't he talk about the Oratorians?
The Oratorians, maybe because they're less prominent. Like he really had this kind of triadic sort of understanding of religious life in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, but I mean, but I used to go like, I was confused by it, but this is, if Newman, whether he knew it or not, but if we can say Newman's judgment that the Jesuits have the sort of rhetorical age of the church, See, Judge, Act, I think, is a rhetorical rendition of what is scientifically discussed by the Dominicans and those like him, and then poetically by the Benedictines and those like him. So See, Judge, Act, I think, is good rhetoric. I think you have to have a philosophical and scientific discussion and then a sort of poetic. But notice that he replicated this. The Benedictines are the poetic, the sea, right? Like poetry is about being receptive. Yeah. The Dominicans, as the scientific age, as he's saying, is the judge. And then the rhetorical one is the act. So, because speech can itself be an act, right? Like this is, I think sometimes we forget this in the modern world. And so I even see him getting this right, that when we think, and when we educate students, right, we're like, the importance of poetry is the starting of being able to be receptive to the world. Then you judge, then you act. We usually do sometimes the exact opposite. We act, then we judge it, and then like we see it for what it is. So I think this is another way, especially for educators, to begin to think about, the role of sight as being reflective before we make rational judgments and then proceed to action.
Well, to jump on one of my hobby horses, I hope that's okay. Earlier this year, 2024, we did a show on culture, and we kind of talked about changes to the devotional life in the Catholic Church after the Second Vatican Council. And I think this is another example. So if you're not wrapping your mind around sort of like the economic development approach, like think about some of the changes in the Catholic Church, and not to poo-poo necessarily some of the impulses that drove that, but on that previous episode, we talked about after the council, there was this kind of desire, I think, for authenticity. Like we don't want just a rote practice of the faith or Catholics to sort of go through the motions. And so a prominent example of a big change was like, the idea of Catholics as fish eaters. Yeah, where on Friday we would abstain from eating meat. And in some like, what's the term, like bishops' conferences in different countries, there was this change in the messaging where it's like, well, don't simply just fulfill that kind of like older instantiation of the discipline. Like you want to reflect on what should my penance be about, and what sort of penance should I embrace on the different Fridays of the year. And so there's kind of a loosening of the practice. Some of the devotions were sort of dropped as kind of like, well, like these litanies and things, are we really like thinking and reflecting on the theological significance? Or are we just kind of repeating phrases that we've memorized? Everyone knows of this dynamic. Well, I think this is an example of like a failure to see, judge, act, and to have this kind of subsidiarity, even in the practice of devotions, because in some cases you had theologians or bishops who are well-trained theologians, and they had their own experience of the faith where they maybe grew up in a context that was very structured with strict ideas of what penance should and devotion should involve. And then they got to their seminary training, and even there sometimes like the mediation of St. Thomas Aquinas was through manuals and things, and it was kind of dry and felt sort of arid. And they went back and they discovered the sources, and there's like this kind of vibrancy, and they learned about the early church, and they wanted to kind of like restore that or bring that to life in our context. And so they made moves and decisions where it's like, well, we're going to kind of have the lay faithful go through this kind of progression or experience that I've had. They're going to love it. But what happened, like on that earlier show, we mentioned Mary Douglas, like you kind of eviscerated the sort of like hooks of the faith that people could hang ideas on. And so the modes that were sources of reflection for persons who weren't necessarily going to be reading 6 or 7 hours a day, those were lost. And, I mean, in the church right now, I think we're tracking backwards in a good way. And there's this kind of balance between like, having sort of like a careful reflection on scripture or on these devotions, but also, young people, I think, are sort of having a sort of hunger to relearn some of the devotions of their forefathers or of their parents and grandparents. But like, I don't know. I don't know if there's the proper care and the sort of reforms that some folks tried to bring about.
No, I think that's very helpful. Here at the end, I want to point back to an episode that we did earlier this season with Ken Craycraft talking about politics. And I think this is a good way to get at this as well. So remember we said too often the sort of Catholic impulse that ends up replicating the spirit of the age is to look at problems in our political life and then either say, we got to resist them or we need to retreat from them. Notice that both act first, right? We need to act. Then we can like see and judge. What we were talking about is, we made a big deal that one of the things that should mark Catholic life in the political sphere is to refuse binaries or descriptions or even just like political horizons that don't match with what the gospel say. So refuse is sort of this first thing we have to do to say we're not going to fall into the retreat, resist binary. But then I think the three things, that three other R's that you can come up with, Bud. What can we do? We can repent of our own sin. We can do reparation, like to the Sacred Heart, for the lack of the lack of love and things towards the Sacred Heart, toward God, and then we can redeem, right? Like our politics should be one of redemption, to redeem situations or people that people think are too far afield. And I think that once again sort of follows this See Judge Act. When we refuse the sort of political prison that so many of us are stuck in, we can begin to really see who we are and repent of our sins. We can then move to judgments about the world. This isn't in alignment with what God wants or intends, so then we can make reparation for those things. And then finally, our actions, we should be moved to act to redeem the world, because that's what Jesus Christ himself did. So I hope those are some examples, Bud, of how See Judge Act, which can be this really small, simple-sounding thing, but if as a principle, hopefully these last two segments can show people how they can really bloom into very important ideas about how we might make decisions different, no matter the organizations we as Catholics find ourselves in. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, this is another one. We talk about this all the time, where we kind of have a vague idea about what we're going to talk about, but clearly you guys, I hope you enjoy the show, but sometimes, Bud, the show is more beneficial, I think, to you and I, because we get to sort of deduce what it is that is sort of floating around in our brains.
Well, if I could give our listeners another action step this week, please join us in our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. We broadcast the Rosary on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. We hope you'll mark your calendars and join us in those prayer times. Also, 2:55 in the afternoon, pray the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. But you can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
The other thing you can see is iowacatholicradio.com on the events page. So June 22nd, that's coming up, West Des Moines, from 4 to 11 p.m. At 1551 Valley West Drive in West Des Moines, the Iowa Catholic Radio Family Celebration. So much to do. Make sure to bring a chair, your family, and your friends. Watch the sunset, the stars shine in the sky, and the big screen at Iowa Catholic Radio Family Celebration. That looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. Then June 23rd through 25th, the St. Sarah route in the Des Moines Diocese for the National Eucharistic Pilgrimage. Go check out online about more information about how to make that work for you if you're available. June 26th in the Tea Room, the Forge presents an evening with Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers. July 1st, the 6th annual Downtown Chamber Golf Outing, so you can check out about that. And then finally, over the horizon, coming in September 28th through 29th, the Christ Our Life Conference, in which people that you know here from Iowa Catholic Radio will be involved as well. Folks, we want to say thank you for all that you do, not only taking your time to listen to us, but all of the volunteer work, all of the time, talent, and treasure that you send our way to make this work. But this ministry is not just the folks on the microphones, behind the boards, or behind the desk. It's your ministry as well, and you make it possible through your donation. So 515-223-1150 to call or text in order to set up a way to donate for Iowa Catholic Radio, or you can go to iowacatholicradio.com to the donate button, Iowa Catholic Radio app. But your donations, it's not only that we appreciate them, that you make local shows like this possible, that you can make our feed, the national shows that you guys enjoy so much. But we can't expand, we can't do this ministry without your prayers, without your volunteer time, and yes, without your treasure. So thank you for everyone who donates. We ask you to prayerfully consider to donate more. 515-223-1150, iowacatholicradio.com, or the Iowa Catholic Radio app. Bud, like I said, I'm just a simple man, but what I see, judge, and act is it's always a blessed benefit to get to record this show with you, and I hope people were able to get something out of it, to get even half as much as I got out of it. It was a great episode today. It
was. Well, I hope you stay cool this next week and into July, Bo. It's funny, I know we're wrapping up the show. We had some friends out of town and from out of town who visited, and when they arrived, they were just blown away by the weather about a week ago.
Yeah.
And it gave sort of maybe a not totally accurate impression of Iowa during the summer. So I feel like we're hitting the Well, we're getting close to the dog days, so
Yeah, we're paying back how cool it was earlier in June. So this is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our families, our city, state, nation, the whole planet, the solar system, the galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.